Our lecture today is going to deal with Impressionism. But first, I want to take a step back away from this time period to consider what we've just been studying in the course. In French art, during the 17 and 1800s, we've talked about Rococo, Neoclassicism, Romanticism, and then in the early 1800s, we get to this art movement called realism. Realism is going to be based on direct observation of the modern world. The subjects that we see in these paintings are not idealized or embellished. Instead, the subject focuses on laborers and common folk. So we have these great paintings of people at work doing their everyday jobs. The most famous painters of this time are Monet and also Courbet. Everyone in these paintings is recognizable. Even the landscapes are going to be recognizable to their area. However, because realism starts in the early 1800s, photography comes along in 1839, and of course it becomes a mania. All of a sudden, we don't need artists anymore to replicate the world. Photography can do it easier, cheaper, and more accurate. In order for art to survive, though, it needed to transform and to change into something new, something different. And that's where we have Edward Manet in 1863 stepping in to create his famous work, Luncheon on the Grass, which basically breaks all the rules of the Academy, such as utilizing linear perspective and chiaroscuro, a narrative to the painting. And he becomes what's known as the father of modern art. But during the lecture on Manet, I did not tell you that he had a following of young artists that would hang out with him every evening at the Café Garbois in Paris. They were called Manet's Circle, and they sat in what was called the Artist Corner, and they talked about art with a capital A. These individuals are going to become the Impressionists. This is the very first secessionist art group that we have. And the leader of the Impressionists, his name was Claude Monet. Now this is what Claude Monet looks like here. Do not confuse him with Edward Manet. Claude Monet leads the Impressionists. Manet was asked if he wanted to join them, and he politely declined. Manet is also going to be one of those artists that dies very young, around the age of 51, complications of syphilis and alcoholism. So let's move on to Impressionism and discuss what that is. In terms of its historical context, it takes place during the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden we're looking at a world that is stopping so much their agricultural living and living more in cities. We have the invention of photography. We have trade opening up with Japan, and that makes a huge impact on the style of art, especially through Japanese prints. Modern artists get a hold of these, they start to replicate them, and they definitely impact what they're going to be producing. Realism, we've already talked about, and then the avant-garde. Avant-garde is referring to not only artists, but also their artworks that are considered to be innovative and experimental. Ideas that are radical for their time is a great way of talking about avant-garde. So when we get to the exam, one of the things you're going to be asked is, how can we identify these different modern art movements? And how can we identify a painting as being impressionist? And what type of subject matter are we going to see in these works? Impressionist paintings are going to be characterized by short, quick, visible brushstrokes that captures the elements of light. There is a certain sketch-like quality about them, a certain roughness. These paintings are also going to be very bright and very colorful. Take a look at this painting by Monet. This is just a standard city street scene. We've got some buildings, we've got some trees, we've got some people, and it looks like snow on the ground. But when we start to zoom into this painting, it is definitely not perfect. It looks like chicken scratch. It just looks like globs of paint. It looks very rough and sketch-like. One of the nicknames that the Impressionists had were the sketchers, and that was definitely a derogatory term. If you painted the appropriate way, the academic way, your nickname would be one of the finishers. There's also no religious scenes or paintings with heavy subject matter in Impressionist works. Impressionism is about scenes of people at rest, leisure, playing, dancing, at the beach, vacationing. These are happy images, and it's so great because these paintings give us a glimpse into what life was like in Paris in the late 19th century. This painting is important, and it's going to be on your study guide, also by Monet. It's called Impression Sunrise, and this is where the Impressionists get their name from, is the title of this work. You can also see from the sun reflection on the water, you have very thick, visible brushstrokes, and really they're throughout the painting. The painting is of a water scene. We've got people out on the river in boats, and again, it's really a perfect example of what an Impressionist painting is all about. The next thing we need to be concerned about is the type of color that the artist is using in this work. And we're not talking so much the physical color, but the way color is represented. Impressionists use what is called perceptual or optical color. And I'm going to tell you the theory behind it, and I'm also going to tell you about the term on plein air. So perceptual or optical color is the color that our eyes perceive an object to be at a particular moment in time. Color is going to be derived from light. And if light changes throughout the day, therefore color must change too. So I know that's kind of a couple of heavy statements, and I'm going to cover the first one in saying that imagine I'm having you doing a drawing or a painting project in class. The lights are on, and then all of a sudden, I'm going to turn the lights out. The color of the object you were painting has now changed. It has darkened. The reason it's done that is because color is derived from light. And we find this out in 1666. Sir Isaac Newton refracts light through a prism, and we get a rainbow of colors. And even later on, Pink Floyd figures this out as well. These 6 colors are called hues. There's always 6 of them. They always emerge from the prism in this order because of their wavelengths. You do not have to memorize them in this order. They are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. I would like you to know that there are 6 of them, and these also happen to be the primary and secondary colors. The primary colors, red, yellow, blue. And when you mix the 2 primaries together, you create a secondary color. For instance, mixing red and yellow together creates orange. Mixing yellow and blue together creates green. So the 3 primaries, the 3 secondaries. So Claude Monet goes out of the studio and he starts painting, for instance, here, these grain stacks. He doesn't paint this grain stack one time. He paints it multiple times. Each of these paintings looking different because he's not really painting the grain stack. He's painting light's effect on it. So different atmospheric conditions, different times of day, different seasons throughout the year, you're going to get a different image. It's light's effect on the grain stack. So he paints this scene over 30 times. The same can be said with the front of this cathedral. He also does this with the Houses of Parliament. We also need to talk about the term en plein air, which is a French term. It just means in the open air. And for the first time, artists are going to take their easels and paints outside of the studio. And while we don't think anything of this today, in the late 1800s, this was insane. It was innovative and revolutionary because up until this time, artists painted strictly in a studio situation. So this is an example of someone painting en plein air. And that is also the only way we can capture perceptual color. So we need to be concerned about how many Impressionist exhibitions there were, and were they successful or not. In all, there's going to be 8 Impressionist exhibitions, and the artist Pissarro is the only Impressionist to exhibit in all of them. As far as attendance, as far as monetary values go, all of these exhibitions are considered failures. You have to imagine that this is a spin-off from the French Salon. 400,000 people would attend the Salon every season. At the most, only 4,000 people attended one of these Impressionist exhibitions. Only 1%. So they were not successful. And even here's a comic from the time, this police officer keeping this pregnant woman out because he felt that the sight of these paintings would harm her unborn baby. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time with Claude Monet because he lived an incredibly long life. He was one of the few artists to live long enough to not only see him become famous, but to also enjoy the fame that it brought. He did rise to prominence in the 1860s and 1870s as leader of the Impressionists. And you have to imagine that Impressionism did not catch on in France for the next 15 years. So it's not until literally the 1880s where these paintings are beginning to become popular. Where they became popular first is in America. And Mrs. Potter Palmer was the richest woman who lived in Chicago. And you could not be a rich American industrialist without a collection of paintings, many of those by Impressionists such as Monet. This is her living room, and you can see on the back wall there, off to the right a little bit, that second painting in is one of Monet's grain stacks. And Monet was also a painter who was highly productive. And he would even kind of make fun of these American industrialists who were buying up all his paintings, but he also never failed to cash any of their checks. When he moved to Giverny, which is his famous estate, he first rented it out. But after 4 years, he was able to purchase it outright. And in fact, he moved here during the same week that Edward Manet passed away. Monet also hired and kept on staff 4 full-time horticulturalists. And you can still tour this estate today, and it's absolutely stunning. Monet was also a car collector, and he had a garage full of cars. In fact, he is noted as having the very first speeding ticket in Giverny. Monet also rerouted nearby tributaries to form these wonderful lakes where his water lilies were. And water lilies at the time were something new and exotic to France. They didn't grow there naturally. And the farmers that were downstream from his estate were concerned that these strange exotic plants might be poisoning the water that their livestock was then going to drink. However, that was not the case, but they did, cause Monet a little bit of problems with that. Monet is also a person who is very, very moody, and even going through some mood swings, he would end up renting out a hotel room to spare his family from his actions. One of the greatest things also was that he was very into talking to the press and to journalists, and it was very much a treat to be invited to Giverny, to be given lunch by Monet because he had a world-class chef working for him. One of the journalists went there for lunch one day, and he couldn't find Monet anywhere. He checked the studio, he checked the house, but he found a set of footprints that he traveled around a building and found the unedifying aspect of Monet jumping up and down on canvases that he did not think were high quality enough. What's also what I would consider modernist about these paintings is that we're looking at a water lily scene that we should be looking at the ground for. But instead, Monet paints these images. He doesn't have a horizon line, and he sets them at eye level. In fact, at some of these locations, you're going to be surrounded by these types of paintings. And this is the experience Monet wanted you to have, to be completely surrounded by art. Monet has this great quote: "When you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, or whatever. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, an oblong of pink, a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives you your own naive impression of the scene before you." So let's go ahead and take a look at this painting and see how that plays in. Again, looking at these Impressionist paintings from a distance, they look absolutely beautiful and nearly perfect. And as we zoom in, though, we see the roughness, we see the sketch-like quality, we see more of the geometric shapes and blobs of color that are really creating this work. And even when this X-ray here, we can see the main brushstrokes that Monet is using to create this work. So Monet was definitely a fan of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. He copies it in his own style, a lot less provocative. And I want to also take a look at some of these other Impressionist artists that are fairly well known. Camille Pissarro, as I had told you earlier in this lecture, was the only person who exhibited at all the Impressionist exhibitions. And this guy was really a mentor to a lot of the other painters. He does a lot of street scenes and also scenes of the country. Another one of laborers. Auguste Renoir, he is known many times as the painter of light, and he has this great quote about how there are enough unpleasant things in this world for us to manufacture more of them. So his paintings are scenes from dance halls like you have here, or people having lunch, and this is one of my favorite paintings that he does because we can see in the lower left-hand corner playing with the dog is his girlfriend who he is going to marry. That is Renoir's dog. The person standing behind her is Renoir's brother. Their neighbor is sitting across the table. And so everything here is very personal. Renoir was left-handed, and he was riding a bicycle, and he fell and he broke his left arm. A couple years later, he does that a second time. And Renoir, before he was a painter, he also worked as a cake decorator. Mary Cassatt, we do have female Impressionist artists, and Mary Cassatt is the main one of them, but she's also unique because she is American. She grew up in Pennsylvania, went to the Pittsburgh School of Fine Arts, but was still very much under the rules of how to paint a painting. She heard about all these radical ideas and things that the Impressionists were doing in Europe, and she went over to France and became one of them. Her subject matters mostly rely on mother and child and also siblings. She did utilize oil paint, but she was a follower of Degas, and she definitely used his style of pastels. And again, that pastel drawing material just adds to the quickness and spontaneousness of these images. In one of her more famous works. And speaking of Edgar Degas, here he is. Degas is most noted for his images of ballerinas. He is also noted for his use of pastels. In fact, many of the techniques that are still taught in school today are derived from Degas and his works. A very modernist point of view for his image, as if we're hovering above this ballerina suspended in air. And also the idea that her hands, her lower arms, and even part of her dress is cropped off or truncated by the edge of the canvas. And this is really important as well because prior to the modern age, everything would be shown within the frame. Here, it's a much more photographic-like quality to his drawings and paintings. Another subject matter he would do is women taking baths, much more of a voyeuristic image where they may not even be aware of our presence. Degas, like many of the Impressionists, is going to go blind near the end of his life. This happens with Claude Monet, who develops cataracts. Mary Cassatt goes blind. Camille Pissarro goes blind. So does Degas. And he does not stop producing art, though. What he does is he shifts mediums and goes from drawing and painting to sculpture. If you're lucky enough to go to the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, California, they have the largest collection of Degas works on the West Coast. And they have this one, the ballerina, all in bronze. And he also does women taking baths as well as sculptures. A lot of these were cast well after his death in the mid-20th century. We also have Berthe Morisot, who is one of the female Impressionists, but also is definitely a muse of Monet. And I'll show you a couple of her works here. This painting by Monet. The Cradle is one of the works that Morisot showed at an Impressionist exhibition. And Berthe Morisot is going to end up marrying Edward Manet's brother, Jean. And they're going to have a child, Julie. And she is going to write a book, and it's kind of a lot of diary entries about growing up with all these Impressionist artists around her. So definitely check that book out. I think it's just called The Diary of Julie Monet. And there are many other Impressionists, too, that don't get the main spotlight that the ones I've shown you do. Unfortunately, this is still an unstable time in history. Frederic Bazille is a fantastic artist, but is never mentioned in any of the history books. He passes away at the age of 28. He dies in battle during the Franco-Prussian War. But I also urge you to check out a lot of these artists' other works, including Bazille's. He does a fantastic amount of paintings. And again, unfortunately, dies at the age of 28. With that, I'd like to go ahead and end this lecture on Impressionism, and I will look forward to seeing you at the Post-Impressionism lecture.